To begin with, I'd like to extend my greetings to all of you and wish that you are well. As you all know, in 2021, we changed the Arya Chema Winter Dharma teachings into spring teachings. Now, you can all hear me, right? Can you hear me? We changed the Arya Chema Winter teachings into spring teachings, and then from then on, for the following 2 years, up until now, the topic of the teachings, what the main topic we've been discussing has been the life of the eighth Karmapa, in particular the autobiographical versus good deeds and his autobiographical praise. He searched thoroughly. So these are the main basis for their teachings. Now, both of these autobiographical verses, the good deeds and the praise he searched thoroughly, are not written in prose. They're written in verse. They're in stanzas in verse. And the author of both the good deeds and he searched thoroughly is Mikyo Dorje himself. And when we look at the autobiographical verses good deeds and the praise he searched thoroughly, he doesn't give any dates or anything like that. He doesn't write about when he was born, the dates of his birth. He doesn't speak about where he went or stayed. He does not say that he went there, he stayed here. He doesn't speak about that. What it primarily describes in these autobiographical verses, they describe clearly in his worldly and dharma experiences how the understanding he developed, his realization, what his resolve and commitments in this lifetime were, and what his thought and what his aims are. And it's how he also actually practiced and put into praxis the Dharma, the true Dharma. And he speaks about all of this really clearly and very vividly. And so I think that these two autobiographies are really extremely important for people who wish to study the Guru's life story as if they are like spiritual instructions, and they're also really very beneficial. Now, this makes me think of a quote by Trupa Kunleg. What he says in this quote is, and I'm not going to read it literally, I'm just going to talk about the meaning. He says, generally, if you're like really too strict or too narrow-minded in biography, if you're like too formal in it, he says that they're kind of like actually the mortgage contract. Like when you're taking a mortgage or a loan, it says on this day of this month, at this time of the day, and then I'm taking a loan of this amount of money. And so everything has like the date, and you take who borrowed. And you have to write them all down very clearly. And so he says that the lives of gurus that are too strict are like mortgage contracts or debt contracts. Saying on this day, on this month, I've taken the loan with this as collateral, and then I've got this in return. And so they're just too narrow-minded. Or say at this year, when at this age, You want to study with this person, performed this activity. And so at this point, if there was a great lama, they got I gave a horse. If there's a great lama, they give because if there's a great lama, then he's a son. If it's a small horse, little horse, then they'd give like blankets or something like that, or I'd give this many bushels of grain. And he says there's no point in writing liberation stories of gurus like that. And if you're going to just write like that way, then you might as well say that today, when the sun rose, I ate this sort of food, and in the evening, I went to the bathroom and had a turd like this one. That's how you should write instead. If you had to write that, then it would just be laughable about it. It really wouldn't be a liberation story of the guru. This is what he says, right? So I think it's like that, really. When I was little. And I was in Serpa. They're like the diaries of the gurus, where they make lists of everything they did day. From one perspective, it's very good. It's actually necessary. If there's someone who's writing the diaries, and I've read these diaries, and most of them, what they are, I said I had this audience, and this people, that someone gave this amount of offerings. It's like the tradition of just recording what offerings were given. You have to write down everything that was offered. So, like this amount of gold and silver. It's easier for someone who knows about them. It's easier to write. And if there's something that you don't know about, like something from a foreign, if you don't know what to write, they write these strange things about it. And there's various different things that come from abroad, like the different toys, and people didn't know what to write, so they wrote all these strange things. So that's what it's kind of like. So many lamas' life liberation stories have talked about the offerings that they were given and where they went and what they did. And that's what these life stories are like, and it's like there's not a whole lot of point to them. You talk about you're writing liberation story of a guru. It shouldn't just be historical record that is written in like a chronological order, but something that is going to affect the minds of this people who are reading. Instead, it should be something that increases their faith in pure perception. It increases their faith and belief, conviction, and gives an example of how to do something to benefit this life. That is what it is. Now, if there's nothing like that in the liberation story of the guru, you can't make things up. It wouldn't be right to do that. But if the guru has those sort of examples of being learned, vanishment, good, and if you just read about all the offerings that they're giving, then there's like you're destroying all the reason for writing a good. If it's just like a mere record of everything that you've received, a record of receipts, then there's no point to it. It's as I said before. It's for the faithful followers to be able to keep the guru's liberation and example in their minds, to increase their faith in pure possession, to increase their faith and conviction. It's like to give them an example of how to do something to benefit themselves in this and future lives. And that is what is really extremely important. And again, the two liberation stories of Mikkyur Dorje have these two really incredible features. In any case, I'm hoping that in these spring teachings, we can completely finish both of these liberation stories of Mikkyur Dorje. Now, our spring teachings go into the 8th of April, right? At the beginning, wasn't supposed to be that long, but we extended a little bit. And it'd be very difficult if we had to extend it any further because it gets very hot in Varanasi where they're staying. And many of the people who've come to spring teachings have come from, have to go to Bhutan and other places. And so they're not, they've come from Bhutan or other cold places. They're not used to such heat. If we don't complete it within the time of the spinning season, if I have to record it or what is it, I will teach it until I'm done, if even have to do it over video. So that you don't have to wait at the spring teaching and stuff, you can return to your own monasteries, and I can continue to teach. In any case, my plan is I will continue to teach these liberation until I'm done. And so the 2 years have passed, and now this is the third year. And if I can't finish these life stories of Miki Dorje, then it's difficult. And then in the future, if I wanted to teach something else, there's a danger that this would take up just too much time. And so that's my plan. So Miki Dorje wrote these as these autobiographical verses in the forms of praises. And the one that I think most of you have probably heard of, or that more have heard about, is probably the praise he searched thoroughly. And the reason for this is that the Sito Panchen Chugye Chungne compiled a prayer book for the Kamsan called the Rabse, or the Completely Bright, and he included this praise he searched thoroughly in that. So this is included in the prayer book. So I remember that how when I was little, we had to memorize this praise that he searched thoroughly, and I can really remember it clearly. And the reason for this is the words are really difficult to say and they're hard to understand. So it's difficult to memorize. So at that time, there was many people who our teacher had to punish them because they couldn't memorize it. And it took so many days. And so because of that, the people who couldn't pass it would come by with a stick or come by with a cane or do various things in Tibet. They have many torture devices in Tibet, and I don't need to speak about them. There's no need to speak about that. In any case, I think that you've basically all heard about the praise he searched thoroughly. But of these two, then, the autobiographical praise good deeds is only in Miki Dorje's collected words. It's not included in anything else. So most of us has probably never seen it before. So what is the reason why these autobiographical verses are called good deeds? I think I've spoken about this already, but I think I'd speak about it, but I think it's as a way to remind you of it all. The reason why it's called the good deeds, and the reason why we call them good deeds. So what is the reason why we have to call this the good deeds? So that's the main question. The second question is, what do we mean when we say good deeds in general? And so the reason why this autobiographical verses are called good deeds, because this liberation story has a total of 37 stanzas. And among these 37 stanzas, 33 of them end with the same refrain. I think of this as one of my good deeds. So this refrain, this one line of refrain is found at the end of each of these 33 verses. So other than the homage and pleasure composed at the beginning and the dedication at the end, all the other verses end by repeating this phrase, good deeds, and so the autobiographical verses are called by the name good deeds. So then the question is, how do we understand the term good deeds then? So good deeds means the good things we've done, things that have been done well. Good deeds or the good action. So a deed means a virtuous action or a good action. That's how we should understand it. For example, there's a famous quote from the way of the Bodhisattva, something we hear all the time. It says, "One moment's anger shatters all good deeds accumulated, and 1,000 in such as giving or offering to the Buddhas." So in speaking about the problems of getting angry, it says that a second of anger can destroy all the good acts, good deeds accumulated in 1,000 aeons. And so when saying this talks about good deeds, such as giving or offering to the Buddha. Likewise, in the Treasury of Abhidharma, it says, all three good deeds are the three purifiers. Non-virtue of the body, etc., is proposed as the three bad deeds. To covet and so forth aren't action, but are the three harmful mental deeds. There is a saying that in the sutras, the Buddha taught about the three bad deeds and the three good deeds. The three types of bad deeds and the three types of good deeds that the Buddha taught. Now, the reason why we speak of them as good deeds or as bad deeds, they explain the reason for this. And this is explained in the treasure, and what the explanation is that when you do unvirtuous actions of the body, such as killing and so forth, they're called bad deeds. The reason is that they're disparaged by great beings, so they're reproachable by the great beings. And also because of doing such actions, they will produce unpleasant full ripenings or karmic results. So they're called bad deeds. The opposite of that are like bodily actions such as prostrating and so forth. These are praised by the great beings and celebrated by great beings, so they are called good deeds. Likewise, the good deeds of body, speech, the good deeds of body, speech, and mind are called the purifiers of body, speech, and mind. For example, the good deeds of body all cleanse the body. All the good deeds of speech purify the speech, and all the good deeds of mind purify the mind. Now, the reason why they're called purifiers is that they they're what purify the stains of the bad deeds of body, speech, and mind. So this is whether they're doing it temporarily or ultimately. In any case, they cleanse and purify all our misdeeds, all our unvirtues, all our faults and offenses. So they cleanse us of and purify them, and so they're called the three purifiers. So in this way, the good deeds mean the good actions that we do with our body, speech, and mind. That's what we mean by the good deeds. Today, there are 33 good deeds described in the autobiographical verses Good Deeds, and among these 33, the one that I will speak about today is the 22nd. So the other day I read the outline aloud, but I didn't show it to you, so I think it's probably clearer if I show it to you. So this outline from the commentary on the good deeds was taken from the commentary on the meaning of the good deeds by Sanjay Paldra. So there are two manuscripts, one from the Potala, there's one from the Potala, and there's also a manuscript that comes from the Drepung Monastery, one of the three great monasteries, the Drepung Monastery. So there are two different manuscripts, and they're very, very different. So these are going to talk about these this outline according to the manuscript from Drepung. So when we speak about, there are three main topics, three main sections: the phylogenetic compose, the nature of the biography, and the conclusion. These are the three main sections of the autobiographical versus good deeds. And so we're in the second, the nature of the biography. And this nature of the biography also has two topics: the preliminaries, how to enter the Dharma, the main part, about how we practice the three paths of the three types of individuals. These are the two subsections of this. And we've already discussed the first of these, the preliminaries, how to enter the Dharma. And so now we're speaking about the second. And the second also has how he practiced the path of the lesser individual, how he practiced the path of the middling individual, and how he practiced the path of the greater individual. And among these three, the one that we are currently speaking about is how we practice the path of the greater individual. Now, when we're speaking about the path of the great individual, there are three parts: the intention to resounding bodhicitta, the action of meditating the two types of bodhicitta, and three, how we train in the precepts of the two types of bodhicitta. So the first two, the intention arousing bodhicitta and the action meditating the two types of bodhicitta, we finished discussing those yesterday. There's a bit more to say, but I think that we can speak about that later. So during this talking about the six transcendences, prajna is not explicitly mentioned. It's taken, the ultimate bodhicitta is taken as fulfilling that, and so it's not speculating. But at that point, there are a few points that I need to discuss when speaking about prajna in terms of talking about the six transcendences. In particular, there are a few things that we need to add in terms of the relation with the Khaji view of Mahamudra. I think there's some points that we need to pay some attention to. So today, what we're speaking about today is how we train in the precepts of the two types of bodhicitta. Now, the way he trained in the two precepts of the two types of bodhicitta has 7 different topics, actually. Now, in the commentary at the beginning, when speaking at the beginning, it says that there are 6, but when you look at the actual topics, as you look in them, there are actually 7 of them. And so I think there must be 7, I believe. And so there are 7 topics within this training the precepts of the two types of bodhicitta. How we trained in the 6 transcendences, to training the purifying the topics, two types of bodhicitta, how he how he trained in the ways of the bodhisattvas, how he acted in accord with time and place, how he did fruitful actions, he gave up fruitfulest ones, how he accomplished the 2 benefits to the power of devotion, and how the clairvoyances gave him the ability to benefit others. So what we were speaking about today is this one, is how he trained in the 6 transcendences. Now, as you all know, the transcendence, we have the 6 types: generosity, discipline, patience, diligence, jhana, and prajna. So the first of these is generosity. And so the root text for the transcendent generosity is this: although inferior material supplies cannot be established as wealth that can be grasped as mine, when the understanding of selflessness had permeated my being, enriched my mothers, I gathered all that could be desired in infinite amounts. I think of this as one of my good deeds. Sometimes I think it's a good idea to give like a word-by-word commentary of the root verses, but since I haven't been doing that before, to give like a word explanation to gloss every word of the text, then it's for some, but not for others, is kind of strange, and so I won't gloss the words of the text. Now, when speaking about how to train in the transcendent generosity, there within Mikhail Dorje's collected works, there's Mikhail Dorje's training in the training instructions and training in the liberation story. And what this it says is here is that the primary cause for Bodhisattva's virtuous activities, such as generosity, to become the path of enlightenment or not, so whether they become the path to Buddhahood or not, primarily comes down to the point of whether they are imbued with relative bodhicitta or prajna, or to say it simply, relative bodhicitta and the view of emptiness. So it depends on whether they're imbued with these two or not. And in particular, if they're imbued with the prajna that realizes emptiness, then no matter what virtue is actually doing, however you accumulate virtue, if it is embraced by the prajna that realizes emptiness by the view of emptiness, if you can do that, then you do them in a state of having no attachment to any things as me or mine. And so you can effortlessly achieve the infinite things that we and others need and want. Now, the reason why this happens is that within the emptiness, dharma, nature, there's no division of things being same or different. It's completely beyond anything being same or different, because it's because you have mastery of this meaning, or you have in power of this meaning of things being neither same nor different. The nature being neither same nor different, then you'll be able to, without any impediment, either actually emanate or to transform innumerable things. If you gain mastery of the Dharma nature that is free of any liberations, then you can be able to eliminate and transform innumerable things that are phenomena that are either same or different. This is what is called in the scriptures as mastery of the samadhi, of the treasury of the sky. It's like, we're talking about the sky. There's no end to the sky, right? There's no center or end to the sky. That's what we're talking about. So the treasury of the sky, it means like a treasure of the sky that has no center and like for us, when we have, no matter how large of a treasury we have, there's one day that it's going to end. There's an amount, a fixed amount within there. But if the treasury of the sky, such a treasure has never has any way of being used up or being exhausted. So this is called mastery over the samadhi of the treasury of the sky. And if you're able to gain mastery over the samadhi of the treasury of the sky, then you're able to give inexhaustible generosity. So for that reason, the bodhisattvas who have achieved the levels, directly or indirectly, give or provide the circumstances for achieving this, they're able to give the things that circumstances for achieving the highest states of true excellence without ever running out or exhausting them. And this is something that only is within the domain of disciples who have the similar fortune as the bodhisattvas do. And there's no danger that they're ever going to be anything that causes samsara, the lower realms. But in addition, they also have the great benefits. The reason is that no matter how much generosity the great bodhisattvas give, the other, when they use it, then it aids those beings in developing superior bodhicitta. So this is talking about the great bodhicittas. Now, for us ordinary individuals, if we have this idea of, wouldn't it be wonderful if I developed the mastery over the samadhi of the treasury of the sky and could be able to give inexhaustibly, then what do we need to do that? And the most important thing for us to do now, at this time when we're in these places of samsara, while we're in samsara, We must not hold any of the places or body or possessions of the to be the best or the permanent. We shouldn't think of them as being great or wonderful. We shouldn't think of our places or body or possessions. If we think of them being permanent and unchanging, immutable, we must not grasp at them as being permanent. The way we should think instead is that all of these possessions and things in samsara are like the basis for all disputes. It's like they're like honey on a razor blade. If a razor blade is a really sharp knife, right? Sharp blade. And if you put some honey on its blade, if you try to lick it off, the honey is really sweet. It's really delicious, right? But if you lick it, because the razor blade is so sharp that if you lick it, then you're going to cut your tongue. So similarly, if we look at the pleasures and wealth of samsara, they seem like they're really wonderful. If they seem really nice and fun, but if we enjoy them, the more we enjoy them and use them, then the more our afflictions are going to increase, and the more fonts we're going to accumulate. And so, for that reason, we need to do what we can to eliminate our attachment to the things of samsara. So, for this reason, no matter what sensory pleasures, we should look at them as like water bubbles. We don't think of water bubbles as being important or significant. Water bubbles, we don't consider to be significant, and we don't try to keep them and think that we can do something with them. And so they're like pointless and useless. Because we need to understand that as futile as that. In addition to being as pointless and meaningless, we produce many faults from the sensory pleasures. They increase our own afflictions. And for other sentient beings, then we have a lot of, it's a basis for people to feel a lot of jealousy and envy and so forth, and create a lot of difficulties and problems. So for that reason, we should have no attachment at all for any of the places, body, or possessions of some sort. We should think, well, whatever there is fine, and not grasp at any of them as being mine or ours. And have practice in seeing them as having no self and not being permanent. If we are able to train in doing this, then someday we will be able to, like the great bodhisattvas, gain mastery over the samadhi of the treasury of the sky, and be able to give innumerable, inexhaustible generosity to other sentient beings and benefit other sentient beings. And so this is what is said in Mikkyö Dorji's instructions on training and liberation starting. And now next, if we'd like to speak about it in terms of the explanation given in Sanjay Paldrup's commentary on the meaning of the good needs. Now, as I said, it's as Mikkyö Dorji said before, we should see that the possessions are pointless and that also the basis of all faults. You should view them this way. However, many of us don't see possessions as being lacking any essence. In addition to that, not only we do think that, in addition, we think that instead of seeing this as having no purpose, we think that they have to give them meaning. I think if we can use the things that we have well, then we can give some meaning to something that has no meaning. And because we've given meaning to something that has no meaning, then we can gather the accumulations. But if we think that we're going to take the meaningless and make it meaningful, we say the point is that we say this, but actually what we're thinking in our minds is saying, maybe I'll get something to eat, if I could have something to drink, if I have some wealth and possessions that I can use, even if I can't use them now. But if I think that in the future I'm going to get it, if you think that I'm going to be at it. So we have a lot of hopes and fears, whether it's external things or whether sentient beings, we feel a lot of craving and lust for them. No, wealth and possessions, we always think we're going to lose them, or we think they're always going to be with us. We cling to them as being permanent, and we think they're all going to be able to use them as we wish. It's like we're grasping at the impermanent as being permanent. Grasping at the things that we don't have control over as if we had control over them. And in thinking in this way, then we work really hard to get and preserve and increase the things that we have. And then we kind of discard all the virtues that we'd have, and it all disappears. And we gather some things that it's not just like kind of saccharine, right? Or only little. If we were fine with that, if we had a certain amount of contentedness and few desires, if we could be satisfied and be happy with it, we'd also have an opportunity to gather a few roots of virtue. But it's not like that. If we only have a few second-rate things or a little bit of wealth and so forth and things, we're not happy with that. I think it's not enough. We're not satisfied. We need to have excellent, wonderful thing. That's what we try to do. We try to gather all of that as much. And once we get even a little bit of something, we wonder, oh, I'm going to run out soon. It's going to be used up soon. And so we're in this like hopes and fears that we're going to lose it all. So I try to get, maybe I better get a little bit more. And so in order to gather wealth and possessions, there are many different ways to gather wealth and so forth. Most of them are not good. None of them are good. You can do the 10 non-virtues or the 5 heinous actions. You would have to accumulate, but if you try to do something good, you aren't going to really be able to get that much. If you can do something that's a little bit bad, you can do something that's kind of bad, do a little bit of like a black market activity or stuff, and then you can get more things. And you'll be able to get more money yourself and be able to gather, accumulate more wealth for yourself. And so in order to gather, if you have to commit the 10 non-virtues, that's fine. If you have to do the 5 virtues, that's fine. And you need to spend your life doing that. And even if you have to give up this human body and even if you have to give up on any hope of having a body in the higher realms in the future, you give up on that. You forget about any opportunity of gathering you give up on that. Instead, you have this like really firm commitment, and then within your heart, like, I'm going to do everything I can until this eon has ended, to accumulating more and more stuff. They probably don't spend a few minutes thinking about Dharma, or maybe if it's amazing, you can spend a few days, or maybe if it's amazing, a couple of days. But we immediately have this, we don't have to work at it. And naturally, we have this wish to get more things. And if I could get a little bit rich, if I could earn some money, we all have this really strong commitment inside of ourselves. And in addition to that, if we're like a monastery, lama in a monastery, if you're like a Rinpoche, you think, I'm going to restore the monastery. I'm going to build this new statue. I'm going to make it so that the Sangha members never have a poor livelihood or poor lifestyle. I'm going to be able to give thousands or tens of thousands of rupees to all the members of the Sangha. And so what they're speaking about is good, what they're speaking. And so this is exactly, is be able to kind of put the blame on someone else like that, but actually, saying you're doing something for the sake of the Sangha, to be able to gather a few offerings to do something for the benefit of the Sangha, and what you receive, when you actually give it, then you actually have a little bit of stinginess. It's like, I'm going to run out, I'm going to run out. And so you get a little bit too stingy, and so when you're actually giving, you're unable to actually give it. You don't dare give it. Even if you give it, then later you think, you get a little regret. Think, oh, that generosity I gave, that wasn't good. I'm running low on money. If I should have kept some of it. I think you regret it. And if when you regret it, then the fire of regret, so when you have the strong fire of regret, then it burns the mind, and all the roots of virtue from giving in the before is like burnt up. If you don't, for example, if you accumulate virtue and you don't dedicate it, then later when you regret it, you feel regret for it, then the previously accumulated roots of virtue are just immediately wasted. And they will not ripen as a good result. And so for this reason, so at the beginning, if we think we should be generous at the beginning, then we're unable to do it. Later, if we give a little bit, then we get regret giving it. And by regretting it, then we waste all of the roots of virtue. And so it often happens like this. So I think I'm going to leave it here for right now. We're going to take a 30-minute break, and then I will return to speak more.
다당기 공돌이야. 아니, 야미기도 지기 디 가르래. 남버타바라 라베 티.
No, I was just speaking about just before I was speaking about how, as described in Mikyu Dorje's instructions and training in the liberation story, we shouldn't, while we're in samsara, we should not cling to things as being permanent. We shouldn't think that they'll be with us, and we shouldn't think that they're things that we can own or control. The way things are is that if you have something today, for example, if you have money today, you can lose it tomorrow. This happens often. In particular these days, because our money is all in the banks, sometimes people steal it and various things happen, and so there's the danger that tomorrow it won't be there. Likewise, there are things that you think you can use under your own control, but you might own something today, but not have it tomorrow. So there's a story about this from Drupal Kunle's life story, and I thought I'd share it with all of you. In general, there are many different stories about Drupal Kunle, and some of them it seems like they're maybe made up. But the ones that I'm teaching, that I speak about, are all that are taken from his collected works, and so I think they're reliable. And so let's tell about one of them. So one day, so in Rinpoche there was a Lord Garpa. This is the Lord of Tsangpa. So they're called Deva Garpa, because they're primarily the sponsors of the Karma Conscience and of the Garchen, the Great Encampment. So they're called the Lord of the Garpa. So at that time in Tibet, it was a time when the Tsangpa Desi lords were getting stronger and stronger. So whoever was the Devagarpa, now I don't know the name. In any case, this lord of Tsangpa sent a letter to Drupal Kunle with a seal on it, and saying, you have to come to where I am right now. So this is the letter that the Lord sent to Drupal Kunle. And when he received the letter, then Drupal Kunle put on Kongpo clothes. He was probably coming through the region of Kongpo. Anyways, he put on a Kongpo costume and went to see the Lord of Deba, or the Lord of Garpa. And when he got there, And he came to the palace or wherever it was that the Lord of Karpa was staying. He got close to this, then there was a member of the Lord's retinue. Uh, so the old and the elected. There are two different. So those there, the people are the lay people and the people who worked for the monastics. The people who worked for the who were lay people who worked. So, anyways, a lay person who worked for the Lord who came there says, and he said, "Oh, I can't stop the king. So we've got some really strong dogs. So I can't stop the dogs. So I'm going to send someone to do this. So please wait a moment," he says. So he went to so within that great, but there's some big dogs near there. They're mastiffs, like they had a really strong mastiff, and they're saying, "I can't stop the dogs," and so I can't stop the dogs. So I'm going to call someone who can hold the dogs back, and said this. And when he said this, then he went first, and then followed. Then Drupal followed him. And when he went behind him, the two dogs came. First is a big white dog that's lunging and jumping from far away. And then following, there was a black dog that was also running. And so he also jumped on it. And when that happened, what Drupal said is he was wearing the Kampo costume, and they normally had a sword at their because they had the sword, and so he took it out immediately. And he struck them each with the sword in the scabbard, and the dogs, when they did it, they started to sing, like he broke them, and they started and left them there. Kind of. Then there are also some. Saying that just the dogs being all white and all dog doesn't. He said this he cut them with a sword. Then he joined the top of the black dog to the hind of the black dog, and the black dog's head to the white dog's hind, and he joined them, and he combined the two together. And then both the dogs, before them, they're about to die, and so then they were hit, and they got up, and the moment that they got up, they ran up and down, and they were playing. So, and when they saw that, and everyone said, "Oh, this is really amazing that you're able to do this, to cut the two dogs in half and then join them to each other's back." And they ran around playing, "This is really amazing." They considered this to be incredibly amazing. Said, "Oh, we go for refuge," and said that. At that point, what Drupal Kunle said, I'm crazy, and Drupal Kunle, so you can't look at how I do things. There's nothing strange, amazing about that. If you think that's important, there are many things that are much more amazing than that. So you shouldn't think that this is being amazing. You think that this is amazing, then? So what is most important? It's better for you to just recite manis, and that's even more beneficial for you, he said. And he danced the mani dance. He danced a dance to the mani mantra and sang a song. I don't need to speak about that. Well, I was singing the song, and at that time, then the lyric, the Lord of Samba came and he came with a big thing, and all of his retainers came. They were also dancing with him, and he had them all dance with Drupal Kunle. Now, the sponsor of that day, Drupal is all the signs of his accomplishment. He did the dance of money, and he had a great fame, and he had really great faith and revulsion at the same time. Revulsion for samsara. And right there, he took the key to the treasury, and he took all of the keys to gave them to, and he said, these are all the keys to my treasuries. And one of these, you take one of these keys, you can pick the key. And whichever key you choose, whichever room that opens, you can take all the things in it. I will give them all to you, he said. Yeah, I will absolutely give them to you. So please choose one. And so Drupal Kunle said, he said, no, I've done it. And he took, but then he took one of the keys. He chose a key. And so he took the key, and the Lord went to the treasury and said, I'll open up this storeroom. When they opened up the storeroom, and what was in that storeroom was a pretty big treasury, actually. On the one side, there was a lot of tea and silks. And on the other side, there are many boxes of gold. And on top of these boxes of gold, there is a kind of more heavier box. And he opened up this everyone. And within that, there are all sorts of gold and silver and coral and various different other articles of jewelry and so forth. When we looked at all these, he took all of the jewelry, and then on the side, there was a nice lute. It's like a lute or like a guitar. It's a really old and he took that off and took that as well. And so when he took these and took all the jewelry and the turquoise and so forth, and he put them all on his body, then everyone, that's what did that next. And then in the evening, when everyone was about to go, when everyone was going away, then the Lord, the Drupal Kunle gave all the jewelry back to the goldsmith. He said, you have to take them. These you have to do this so that I can gather the accumulation of merit. He said, you have to take them. In any case, when Drupal Kunle was going out, he gave them back to Drupal Kunle. He said, you have to take them as Drupal Kunle is living. And when it's doing that, then so the Lord said, you have to take them. Now, what this shows is that the main point is here. That's related to this. And what it's saying is that, so for a while I wore them, but there's no one who can keep them forever. So no one can keep them forever. I wore them for a while. So instead of that, I'll sing the song. And so he sang a song instead of that. Now, I don't really say the whole song, but the main point of the song is that all this gold and silver jewelry, if you look at it, it seems really nice, but one day you're going to lose all of, there's a day when you're going to leave all of that behind and go. At that time, you'll feel very sad. So he's saying this in a song. And he took that old lute, right? So he had that old lute. He's played the song and he did a job and played and he did a dance to dance at the same time. And everyone had everyone had great experience and realization from that. And so what this shows is, I think, is that, as I said before, Drupal Kunle, the Lord of Tsimbu, was basically like the king of Tibet, and at that point was extremely rich. and had all these precious jewelry in that. And when he'd give it to, I knew that most people, if they were given, they'd say, "Oh, please, thank you." They'd join their plums and they'd hold it above, they'd carry it away, holding above their crown of their heads. But Drupal Kunle, Christopher pretended not to take it. It's like he was like kind of, even if he wanted to do it. Even if people don't want it, they sometimes pretend I don't want it. Like, oh, I don't know, you don't need this. But Drupal didn't do that at all. He wasn't like that at all. The money was given, he took it immediately. He took the money. He probably spent the whole day there. And as he's going and getting ready to go, then he gave it all back. When he gave it back, he says, "You have to take them." And when I said, "Oh, you have to take them," what he said is, "I've worn them for a while, but there's no one who can wear them forever. There's no one who doesn't need it. And the day they die, then there's no way you can take the jewelry along with you when you go. And so you shouldn't be attached to the wealth and jewelry and possessions as being important. What's really important is that you use them well." And so as we was talking about making the meaningless meaningful, if you know how to use wealth and so forth, then you can gather the roots of virtue and so forth. And it can be used to accumulate virtue. In any case, we think about Gyeong Michel Dorje, for example. As I was mentioning before, he developed the view of emptiness within his being, and so he saw that there was no person enjoying things or any things that were being used. He saw that none of them were true or permanent. Because he'd realized this, and basically had no sense of the thing, this being mine, whatever things that he said, this is mine. He basically never thought this at all. He had almost no things he thought of as his own. And also he understood that whether you have possessions or not, it depends upon your good and bad karma. If you've done good karma, then will have possessions. If you've done bad karma, no matter how hard you work, you won't have possessions and wealth. And he understood this critical point. But for all the centuries who hadn't realized that, in order to provide them with sustenance and prosperity for them, all that he did with his body, speech, and mind, he gathered virtue for the sake of all others, as other sentient beings achieving Buddhahood. Even when he was going to bed at night, he never ceased gathering the roots of virtue like this. So even when he's sleeping, no matter whatever activity he was doing, he said that it all became like a part of the path for achieving great enlightenment. He did all of it for the sake of bringing all sentient beings to Buddhahood. He didn't do any just pointless things or anything that didn't end up having a meaning. And this deed of doing everything for the sake of other sentient beings was not something that was just in this lifetime. It's even previous lifetimes he had gathered great merit to be able to do this. Done this previously, and this is our signs of this that happened in this lifetime. So what are the signs that he had also behaved in this way? What his students said was, Mikyu Dorje himself, like for example, in order for us to gather some wealth and possession, there weren't so many ways to do it in the old days. Either you had to do business, you had to be a merchant, or you had to be farming, or you had to be a nomad, or to pretend to be a lama and go off to gather. You have to go and beg for things. Other than that, There was no other way to get any wealth or possessions. But Mikidorji himself, he didn't do farming, he didn't didn't act as a domestic, he didn't do any business, he didn't gather anything, he didn't do anything to gather money. But because of his previous accumulation of merit, Mikidorji naturally accumulated all of the finest riches, the best, the nicest rich things naturally came into his presence or into his possession. And likewise, Mikidorji himself, just because if someone just became Mikidorji's student or attendant, just the moment you become as like an attendant or a student, because of Mikidorji's merit, one would be able to get all the things that you knew to be like rocks on the road. When you're going down a road, there's as many rocks as you want. You don't need to look for them; they're just right there. So whatever you wanted, with spontaneous and infinity to have, and you could enjoy them all as much as you want. Likewise, wherever Mikidorji himself stayed, there were never any famines, there are no epidemics or contagions. Like there was like as prosperous as if the gods. This is why in Tibet there was a saying, it's like there's no limit to the Karmapa's wealth, that's it. Maybe many of you have heard this. They say that there's no one like the Karmapa in wealth and no limit to his wealth. The main point is that no one can compare to the Karmapa and the amount of, in terms of wealth. There's no way you can compare to the Karmapa in wealth. The Karmapa had at that time, there are many people who came from China, Mongolia, and Tibet to make offerings to him. And there were many people who came to study from China, Mongolia, and Tibet to study with him. As I mentioned before, like when they had the Karchen Munlams, and they had the audience of the gondola, as I mentioned in previous years. That's a kind, and then the audience of the gondola was like making an exhibition. Like you prepare them, and then in front of that you'd show, but all of the put out all the offerings articles that had been given from the emperors of China and Mongolia and Tibet, and arrange them all. And then you put us in at that time like the lord of central Tibet, or the king, was the king Neudong. And when these kings would come and see this, then they'd say, "This is like the treasury of Vaishravana," they said. They said, "What is this? Is really the way it is?" And they're like really amazed to see this. They'd be really amazed. This is what they would say. In any case, one of all the various riches of China, Mongolia, and Tibet, and in particular, there was an offer making vast offerings to the three jewels. This was very famous at that time. It's like it said, don't rival the Karmapa in wealth. So the Karmapa was offered many riches from China, Tibet, and Mongolia, but Mikidorji himself had not of all attachment to any of it. He gave it all to others without reservations. Not only did he give it to others, but what some people did is that even without the Karmapa's permission, without the Karmapa's agreeing to it, they just take his things. As I said last year, right? At that time, this is during the Ming Dynasty in China, right? So the Ming Emperor invited Mikidorji to come and see him. And at that time, they brought a whole lot of offerings. So now, at that time, we look at the historical the documents, and I think it's like it's like an amazing amount of this, just an inconceivable amount of offerings that were sent. And in the end, the Karmapa didn't go, and because it didn't go, It's like they said, if you aren't going to come, we are going to give the offerings. And it's like they pretended, it seemed as they're going, if you don't come along, so we're not going to give, we're not going to make the offerings. And it's like they pretended to go. And when they said that, then the Changzi, the steward, said, there's so many offerings, if we let the Algoa. The Changzi went off with them. He went with the Chinese ministers, he went along with them. The Changzi spoke with must have given some sort of little bribe to the Chinese messenger, and he went along with them. And there are many different stories about that. In any case, at that time, many of the offerings were lost. Some of the steward took it, some of them may be offered, they say. Some of them were stolen, some were in various different places. Now, most of the offerings that the Ming Emperor had sent were lost. And so that's how it was. So some people, even if some Mikyo Dorje hadn't given any permission or said they could, the people just took things away from him. But Mikyo Dorje never looked to say never tried to find out who found them or searched or chased them. So there's some people would stay near Mikyo Dorje for a certain amount of time, and at the end, when they'd go, they take many of Mikyo Dorje's things and they go off to their own going place. There are many people who did this. And most people just couldn't get their minds around this. It was horrible for someone to do that. It's just it takes so much of Mikyo Dorje. It's just inappropriate. It's wrong. This is what people would say because they couldn't understand. So someone spent a certain amount of time with Mikyo Dorje, and in the end, the person would take all of Mikyo Dorje's things and go off on their own. This happened many times. And what Mikyo Dorje would say to all of them is really excellent that they have taken so much as so many numerous of, because if they had spent all that time staying with me and serving me and then went away as pictures, then that would be terrible, wouldn't it? And so when they went, if they've taken as much as they want, then that's really excellent that they could. If they'd stayed with it and they went off as beggars, then that would be horrible, he said. And so he never really searched for them or chased them. And there must have been really very serious incidents like this. And so many people said, these horrible people. The Tibetan kings said, you should send track them to the king and have them sentence to death. You shouldn't let this happen, many people must have said to him. Or some people would say, these horrible people have wasted all the possessions of the Guru, who is the embodiment of the three jewels. They've used them up, they've wasted them. So it's like the offense is stealing from all the Buddhas and all the sentient beings. They've had the misdeed of stealing from all the three jewels. And so the only way that the place that they can go is the incessant, the lowest of all the hells. The way the Karmapa gathers a retinue and gives away is not good. It's because giving impure generosity and impure retinue doesn't help at all. But these people weren't able to understand even a little bit how the Bodhisattvas gather a retinue. So what is the way that a Bodhisattva gathers a retinue and students? The Bodhisattvas, or the way that Bodhisattvas think, the way that they act, is for the sake of all sentient beings without bias. They want to free them all from the temporary suffering, from the deprivation of lacking food and poverty. And they also protect them from the suffering of being deprived of liberation and omniscience. And so they accomplish ways to bring this. Is the aim of a bodhisattva, is to protect these beings. And in order to do this, what they do is they do the practice of aspiring and engaged bodhicitta. And for someone like Mikyo Dorje, then he practiced the superior practice of engagement and of aspirational engaged bodhicitta, not just in this lifetime, but in many previous lifetimes. And so for all the students who gathered, he would give those who wanted the Dharma, those who wanted material things, he'd give them whatever they wish. He'd give people what they want so they could enjoy what they wished. And so this matched what the Guru wanted. It's his own intention. His intention was a bodhisattva's intention. Generally, Mikyo Dorje, whether you stayed with him or whether you weren't around him, whether you were a student of his or not, essentially you're one of his mother's ascension being from that way in many different ways. Even if you were deprived and poor, he's trying to free you from that state of being deprived and poor. If you're deprived of happiness, then you give what you give to, as they may be happy. And this is the only thing that he intended to do. He didn't see that on my own bodies and possessions, my things, all my life is being wasted. They're all being wasted. And because of everything being wasted, he didn't ever get offended. This never happened for him at all. He never got offended at this. Not only that, no matter how much of his things and riches they wasted, he'd feel even more compassion for them. It became a circumstance for him to feel more compassion. It never became a circumstance for him to feel offense or anger. But sometimes, if you're going to be skillful in actions, there are some times where to be skillful, you do have to punish others. But other than that, if there's no particular need to it, you never punished or he never punished any others for in that way. In particular, as I said before, for the great bodhisattvas, they give all their bodies and things for the sake of other sentient beings. And the more the other people can use these things that they have given, then the more it becomes a cause for achieving the happiness of liberation and omniscience. So it becomes a way to achieve happiness, the happiness of liberation and omniscience, and also becomes a circumstance for bodhicitta to increase. Likewise, for us ordinary individuals, for example, when we are generous, for us beginners, first we think that there are things that are better, so that there are things that we should give, things we shouldn't give. We think for the people who we give to, we think that there are people that are better and worse people to give to. And so for beginning sentient beings, there are different types of the things that we give, and there are different, and the recipients, there are distinctions of good or bad, but for bodhisattva, there's no distinction of being the recipients as being better or worse, or the things being better and worse. And the reason why there's no distinction is for the bodhisattvas, great bodhisattvas, as I mentioned before, they recognize that whatever virtue they include, such as generosity, it's imbued with relative and ultimate bodhicitta, or with the relative resolve of bodhicitta and the vow, with the view of emptiness. So it's imbued with the prajna and means. And so when you're giving in that sense, there is no recipient of generosity who is established as true and permanent. But relatively, in order to gather the accumulations to gather to achieve enlightenment, there's no difference between a Buddha and sentient beings. There's no distinction of one as being better or worse. And so in this way, he didn't distinguish one as being superior and the other as being inferior. For this reason, Mikyo Dorje himself, when anyone took any of his things, and he heard that someone took it, then many people inside and out were unhappy about this and were uncomfortable. But Mikyo Dorje himself had no discomfort about this at all. And because of his not feeling disturbed by it at all, then this is really beneficial for many of his students. And the reason why this is, for one perspective, people would look at it, they began to understand the defects of wasting the Lama's things. And it became a circumstance for them to develop compassion for those who wasted the Guru's things. And they saw that no matter how badly the people around him worked, he was never disturbed and never angered by it. And they thought, this is really amazing, that he's really different than other gurus. And it became a condition for people to increase their devotion. So in brief, when you think about it in terms of generosity and giving generously, then Mikyo Dorje himself, there are probably thousands of people in the great encampment, the Garchen, and there are many thousands of people around him. And the Karmapa provided them all with everything they ate and drank. It all came because of the Karmapa. He protected them from the he provided them with everything they needed. Likewise, there are also the sanghas in the monastery of study and practice who needed to be sustained with the dharma and livelihood. He gave them all excellent food and clothing and bedding and all the other requisites that they needed. In particular, Mikyo Dorje himself had especially great compassion for the sick. Whenever he'd see someone who's sick, he would help with medicine. He'd help them finding doctors. He'd help them find nurses, and he'd give them food. And when they were going back and forth, he would give them pack animals and horses and so forth for transport if they needed them. And so he benefited he helped the ill 100 more times than even their parents would. So among all the practices of the six transcendences, this shows how he has the great practice of generosity. So this is probably enough for today. So tomorrow's a day off, and then the day after tomorrow, we'll speak about, I think I can probably speak about discipline, patience, and diligence. But I'm going to speak about, there are a few points about that. But I'm sometimes not worried about as where winter things. As I said in the past before, there are a few things that I've said that I should speak about last year. Now, one of these is, I think I should probably speak a little bit more about the Great Encampment, but probably won't have time for that this year. Perhaps I should speak a little bit more about the black pills. Among the semi-substance of the black pills, these I think probably good to speak about them because they're collected to Mikyo Dorje. Likewise, there's also so Mikyo Dorje's main disciple was Shamar Kuncho Yenak. And he used the reincarnation of the fourth Shamar Rinpoche. Now there are two said to be two reincarnations of the fourth Shamar, and I should speak about this. So at that point, how it is that Mikidorji took care of the other, and how the other, who is said to be the Shama Rinpoche, what happened with him. So in any case, there are another few topics. A few of important topics, that there's something there to speak about, some things that we need to pay attention to. And I think it's good if I speak about those in particular, but we'll do that in terms of the time.